All right. A lot of you guys have businesses. Everyone here has a business, obviously. And at some point, you may want to sell it. So, how do you think about what are the steps that you need to do as that process goes? And what is your company worth? So, we have Harry here today with McLean Group. Take it away.
All right, thanks. So, who thinks they will want to sell their company eventually? Someday. Okay, so I'll explain what we do, who I am, what we do. I'll kind of go through just high level on a bunch of topics. I'll try not to get too down in the weeds, but feel free to jump in anytime with any questions about this stuff. So, um, Harry Ward, I live and work here in Virginia Beach, actually, but my firm is called the McLean Group. We're based in McLean, Virginia. It's a middle market investment bank, and that a lot of times makes people think of Wall Street, but we're one of hundreds of what they call boutique investment banks out there. And what we do for the most part is mergers and acquisitions. So generally we're selling. So investment banks tend to be what they call the sell side, where you're taking companies to market or you're raising money for companies. And then you'll hear private equity, which is the buy side. So they're the ones who buy companies. So we'll take companies out to market and either sell them to a bigger company or sell them to a private equity group. So we have two things really. We have a valuation group that does formal valuations of companies. So again, this is when your company's down the road further. You've got cash flows you've been building for years, and at some point you might need a formal valuation for something like, well, you don't want it to be for divorce, but divorce or life insurance purposes. There's a lot of reasons why you would need a formal valuation of the company. So that's actually separate from what we'd say is the market value of the company. And there we would work with the M&A group, mergers and acquisitions, and we do reports all the time that give a sense for if you went out to market, here's what range we think your company would be in and why. So hopefully that at least sets the stage for who we are and what we do. So most of our deals, and this is just an example of some of these are called tombstones. You may see these from time to time in Wall Street Journal or something. So these are just things that are published when we complete a deal. So usually it's our client is on the top. So this is one where we got an investment in a company called Ultisat from a private equity group called LLR Partners in Philadelphia. Some of these other, like Global Trek, was a company that was sold to Orbcom. So a lot of our deals tend to be so it's lower middle market. We call them small. I mean, a lot of them are most of the deals are sort of $20 to $80 million deals, but then we'll do some that are smaller than that. And we love to, talk with people who are starting and growing small businesses and kind of just let them know what's out there and how this works. So that's the purpose today. So jump in with any questions. There's no dumb questions. And hopefully I can give better than a dumb answer. So there's multiple ways to monetize or, to cash in your company. M&A, this is where we take the company to market, we sell it. Recapitalization, this is where you might have, you've got cash flows, you're able to raise debt based on those cash flows. So a bank or a private equity group comes in and says, hey, look, I'll give you a big chunk of cash, but then they have the rights to the cash flows to pay that debt back off. So that's actually one way to take money out of your company. ESOP, we actually do more and more of these, employee stock ownership program, where it's really kind of the same thing. You raise debt, but as the debt gets paid down, instead of you owning it, the employees start to own the company, and it's got big tax breaks. It's a really interesting thing that's growing, especially with increasing taxes. And then there's sort of middle of the road where people will sell to family or key employees if it's more of a family business, and or maybe there's just not a good market for it with other companies and private equity groups. So these are some of the ways that you can cash out your business someday. Any questions? And again, a lot of this is just kind of background information, but maybe you see these words sometimes. We break it basically the buyer universe into strategic buyers and financial buyers. So a strategic buyer is a company. So that would be, one example there was Orthcom. It's a satellite company. They're operating, but then they have cash and they have people who go out and make acquisitions of small companies. So that would be a strategic buyer, where they're looking usually at a product or a technology that you have to roll in, whether if it's a software product that they can bring internally and make it a bigger part of sell to their customers, make it a big part of their business. And then there's financial buyers, which are the private equity groups I mentioned. So they'll come in, and usually it's because you want more of a flexible deal where maybe you don't want to cash it all out at once. You want to sell 70% of the company, continue to be involved. The private equity group brings in some new strategies and money, and then the company grows. And then when you sell your other, they call it the second bite of the apple, when you sell the rest of it, we've had clients who've made more on the second 25% than they did on the first 75% when they sold it. So it's pretty interesting. So the process, I won't get too deep into this, but basically, the idea is to maximize the purchase price. So really what we do is we create a competitive process when we take a company out to market. And it might be, we'll have a list of, let's say, 80 potential buyers. It's surprising how quickly the list can grow. But we put together a lot of information, virtual data rooms, all kinds of stuff, and then go out to these potential buyers, market the company, and then you'll get a certain percentage of those that'll sign a non-disclosure and want to look deeper at the information, and then a certain percentage of those that are interested enough to make an offer. And then you go into meetings and then get very detailed offers that might just be 2 or 3. And then you whittle it down to really one party that you go into due diligence with, they call it. And so at that point, you've got a timeline to close, and the whole process can take basically 6 to 9 months for a good-sized company. A lot of details, a lot of lawyers involved toward the end. That's more for pitching to a client. But so the big thing is we do a lot of preparation. We have a lot of kind of those young analysts you hear about that are overworked all the time and work weekends, and sometimes they'll they'll sleep over at the office. We have those guys. I mean, it just happens sometimes because there's just so many details and so much to do, and each buyer might have a bunch of questions. So it's really a very involved and pretty, I won't say it's complicated. It's not rocket science, but there's just a million details to kind of cover and take care of. So can be a pretty tiring process. Again,
how many of those processes does your company have ongoing at one time?
Good question. So right now, I think we have about a total of 65 people at our firm. About 20 of those are in the valuation group. So on the other side, the M&A process, I think we have about 15 deals going right now. Now, not all of those will close, but we close on average about 12 to 14 deals a year as a firm. And the way we're paid, by the way, is so it tends to be, there'll be a retainer to make sure, it defrays some costs, but mainly it makes sure that the client has skin in the game, that they're not just saying, hey, go shop it around, see if we can get a great deal. They have to make a decision to write a check and make sure that they're truly part of the process, and they're going to take our call when we call.
That 4 to 6 weeks of intense diligence, you're going to get paid on that regardless of how they proceed afterwards?
No. So if and this is a painful question to answer, if they pull the plug in the last week, which had happened last year, everything goes away. So then we get paid a percentage on the close. So if it doesn't close for whatever reason, we had one where one seller just had, even though she was about a 20% owner in the company, we hadn't talked to her in months, but everyone else was on board and moving forward. Apparently she just, she convinced everyone that it wasn't time to sell. They pulled the plug, and so all of our work just went down the drain.
Have you ever had a company try to take all of your due diligence work to someone else?
They can't. That's one thing. We get very tight. Good question, but our documents are extremely tight. It's they have an exclusive agreement with us to go to market. So, and there's a pretty big process. We're always in processes of competing to get deals too. So sometimes it's just a relationship we built over years, and there's just no question they don't bother competing us with someone. Sometimes I was on a call this morning. There's 9 investment banks in a competition, drawing up proposals that they'll whittle down, and hopefully we win it. But
so if they start with you and they back out, do they have like a clause that they then cannot sell for a specific amount of time?
It's not that they can't sell; it's they do. We get paid. So if that company, the one I mentioned from last year, if they did sell, we would have legal right to claim our fee, basically our full fee. Yeah, it's called a tail that they have on the tail on the agreement. Good questions. This just kind of steps through those processes and the steps in the process, and then the timeline. So CIM, distribution of SIM, that's a confidential information memorandum, or we just call it the book. So basically what our analysts are doing is collecting all this information, and there's a lot of phone calls and questions, but what we try to do is we build a book that it's a document that maybe is 60, 70 pages long. And the idea is that you get everything that a buyer could need to know to make an offer. An initial offer is not a binding offer. It's, hey, we think it's called an indication of interest. We think your company is worth $25 to $32 million. If all of these conditions are met, and then we use those as kind of like the ticket to get to those meetings if they're in the right range. But then that book, they'll have other questions, but we try to put everything we can in that book so that we don't have to answer each question to each potential buyer. So this just talks about some of the valuation, the drivers of valuation, and we'll get into this because it's kind of more about the process. I want to make sure I get to the things that are important for building value in your company as you go on, because I've looked at, I'm involved in some startups and different industries, but part of what we do is we try to build from day one, even with $0 of revenue. Think about who would the potential buyers be, and then as we go on, keep building that list actually, and talk with those people, whether they're competitors, suppliers, who they might be. Just keep in the back of your mind that this could be someone who would buy me someday. So what questions would I want to ask around that? Like if they make an acquisition, for example, like an XPO, maybe you read about it and you say, why were you guys interested in this? And you can try to ask them. I would ask them, how much did you pay for that? And then how much profitability do they have? They might not answer that, but it's worth asking. And maybe even let them know, that, hey, someday we'd love to talk to you in the vein of an acquisition, but they may, each company is going to have different things that they look at and they value. And so you can actually make some of your internal decisions based on that. And, what IT system to use, what, the type of hiring you do, what customers that you go after, diversifying your customer base, things like that are going to be interesting to that buyer. So these are some big things. As you get more mature in your company, financial audits, it's really hard to pay for those early on, but 2 to 3 years out, you should start getting audited financials, because it means so much more than just whatever you slap down on paper, or pull out of your accounting system and then rework the numbers. That's not quite the same as an audit from an accounting firm. Number 2 is one of the biggest ones. If you want to exit your company, always be trying to groom good management and actually give them authority. Every entrepreneur says that they have a good management team. 90% of them don't give those people any authority because they hold on too tight, so they might say they want to, but it's a little bit of a risk, but try it, try to let people run with projects and have more authority, because if they surprise you, then they become a key employee and they become one of your keys to retirement eventually too. Because one of the hardest things to do is to get through a process where we're selling a company and everything's lined up. The company's cash flows are great, products are great, customers, but there's just no management team in place. You've taken out a certain group of buyers. Now there's some that will come in and just maybe clean house anyway, although that doesn't really happen as much as people think. But for the most part, you want to be able to step out and the company continues to run. Some of these others are kind of obvious, build a detailed project and sales pipeline, always keep it updated so you can show potential buyers. Invest in good systems, number 5, again, but think about what is of interest to the bigger players in the industry for when it comes time to go to market. And then let's skip around a little bit. 7, toward the end, what's really interesting is at some point, you're probably aware of this or maybe doing it already, companies tend to have creative ways to pull cash out or expense things when they're young. And then that'll become a habit, and owners will basically just kind of live out of the bank account of the company and write a lot of things off. Well, that's fine and it works, but as you get closer to selling, you need to start shifting toward what was my actual income. I paid taxes on it. You don't want to have any repercussions if you didn't pay taxes on some of the stuff. So it's painful, but you actually have to, it's one of the few times when taxes might actually be an investment, where it's like, here was our taxable income, we paid taxes. And then when you can show, your tax return saying that this was real income, not just something that we made up. So for a few years before you go to market, that's something you have to start doing too. Build an outside advisory team. Does anybody have an advisory board with your company? I mean, actually, you're part of advisory boards. I mean, you have outside advice anyway, but it's something to think about. Like, well, not necessarily your board of directors, but if there's someone who, even a family friend or whatever, who's smart about accounting or whatever, maybe you say, hey, would you mind being a part of our advisory board, and start building that. Maybe there's only one person at first, but you generally don't have to pay them. You're asking a favor, and it's twice a year or something. You have it at a restaurant, but then you get these smart people thinking about things that you're doing and answering questions for you, and probably helping make connections to other people. So advisory boards are kind of something I think that aren't used enough. But really, from day one, if you can do that, start kind of asking people to sit on this board, and then you'll get emails back from them. And again, I think the networking piece of it can be really important. Then we'll get too deep into a lot of this other stuff. There's financial add backs. That kind of talked about that with tax. That's where you're taking out money to pay for your own automobile or plane. See a lot of that with companies as they get bigger. There's a airplane on the balance sheet of the company, not necessarily something that every buyer is going to want. So you try to just start minimizing those things as you get closer to going to market. I'm sure some of you already wrestled with the whole what entity to LLC, S Corp, C Corp, all those kind of things. I think when you're very young, it doesn't matter that much, but at some point that's an issue to wrestle with. You want to convert. These are okay. So this is this just talks about when we're valuing a company, giving the value of the company, the way that we do it. They tend to say that there are 3 or 4 different ways of looking at the value of the company. So guideline public companies, the top one there. This is one where we had done evaluation for a company, smaller company. So you go by, publicly available multiples and that sort of thing for publicly traded companies. That'll give you something to compare it to. Those are just two of the same. And then transaction comparables, this is where it's actual M&A transactions in databases that we have access to. So we'll look and say, hey, company in logistics industry with technology, what are the deals that were done? What kind of information do we have? Well, here's the range of multiples on those, and apply it to your financials. And then the discounted cash flow method is, I'll run through it. Some of you may have a good accounting and financial background, others may not, but I'll just kind of explain a little bit what it is. But this is more of a mathematical, where you take your projections out into the future and then discount it based on the time value of money and risk to today, and it gives you a range of numbers. It tends to be a tighter range because it's just a calculation. So then the art is this green box, taking all these and then giving the range that we think this company will sell for. But it's really pretty surprising, actually, how accurate we wind up being by doing these different methods and putting them together. So in this case, we'd be telling them that they're worth maybe 22 to 28 million. Excuse me. Is any questions, or is this interesting? No standing ovation. Just kidding.
Is there within certain industries, is there a rule of thumb percentage of valuation as it relates to revenue? You know, I mean, so like in X, you know.
Yep. As far as size, yeah.
Yeah. So if you have an insurance company that's doing, you know, doing $5 million in revenue.
Yeah. Yeah. So the it's not a rule of thumb, and that's where the artwork is, you know. But one of the things that, like for example, in the discounted cash flow, what you wind up doing is you get a discount rate, it's called. So let's say you have these each year for 5 years, you have cash flows kind of laid out. Well, each one will get divided by a number. So the one 5 years out will get divided by this discount rate, but to the 5th power, and 4th power, 3rd power. So the bigger this discount rate is, or that you're reducing the number by, the smaller your total value will be. If that makes sense. But one of the factors in that is a size premium or a size discount. So if you're a $3 million company, but you're comparing to a $50 million company, that part of the discount rate will be higher, meaning there's more risk. Because obviously with a smaller company, you don't have the size and sort of longevity that a bigger company does. And then the other part is just kind of eyeballing it, like, hey, we're comparing to a $50 million company, you're going to be lower, and some of that's just deals we've done, or just kind of our standard knowledge of the industry.
Is one of those for EBITDA? If I might.
So EBITDA, let's see if I might have the explanation. I should have that in here. If I don't, I'll explain it. So that's a great question, because are you guys familiar with EBITDA? Okay, so earning before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And really what that means is, what are the operating cash flows of the company before you have to pay all these things that have nothing to do with operating a company? So taxes, interest, one company with $10 million in cash flow may be paying out $9 million in interest because they've loaded up with debt. Another one might be paying out no interest. So to a buyer, and it's a great question, because to a buyer, that doesn't matter. If someone buys your company, it's your job to extinguish your debt. So to them, the $10 million in EBITDA makes one company just as valuable as the other one. It's just you're going to get less out of it because you have to pay off your debt after the sale. So that's why you remove those non-cash things like depreciation and amortization and reduce your taxable income, but they're not actually cash draws on the company. That cash is there. It just reduced your taxable income. And then interest and taxes obviously are non-operational expenses.
Does your company come in, do people request your services if someone wants to forcibly purchase their company from them? Such as we had the guy in here who Google wanted to buy whatever he created.
No, not us, because they could, but we probably wouldn't
It's not your field.
bother with it. And the reason is they would probably, if it was big enough, they would probably go to more of a Wall Street firm. Like we sell companies to public companies all the time, but we don't do many deals. Like we don't take public companies private or issue new securities. And what I'm getting at is that can only happen with public companies. You can't do a hostile takeover of a private company. So you can't walk in the door of a private company and say, I'm buying you, because the owner will say, no, thanks. And that's it. That's the end of the conversation. Whereas if it's a public company, they have access to your shares through the market. So does that make sense? No?
It does, but I'm not buying what you're selling.
Oh yeah. So, I mean, you can't do a hostile takeover of a private company. If I own 51% of the stock or more of my company, it is completely up to me whether I sell to anyone.
But Google would have.
Google threatened to crush him, but he did not.
Oh yeah. So that would be different. Right.
That's
So that's,
different. That's
sorry.
also a threat,
That's a different thing, which is more of a business threat, right? It's a
Right.
great question,
but he didn't have to sell.
from our viewpoint, it's about securities and stock.
Okay.
You can't hostily buy that private company. The
I
guy
guess
can
what
just-
I was asking was, would you create the data for him to say this is what it's actually worth? Google?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so here's so let me really answer your question then. So we had a deal last year or 2 years ago now where Boeing had made an offer to a company, and what they wanted us to do was exactly what you're saying is, hey, collect our information. We don't know whether this is a rational offer or not. Can you just get that information together, start running the process, and then negotiate with these guys? And we said what we always say, which is yes, but we also would like to run a competitive process with maybe 3 or 4 other buyers, the obvious Lockheed Martin and some of these others. Well, the second that they signed us, we know the Boeing guys, called the corporate development guys, and they're like, damn it, I thought we had this one. So they called us and they're like, all right, I understand they hired you. So the offer goes up immediately, right? Then we start running the process. Long story short, they dropped out pretty early in our process, and we wound up selling to another company for like 50% more than these guys had offered. So yes, that is something that it was just a question of the force.
Sorry.
There's no, that's okay. No, it's a great question. It's just, as far as a forcible sale, that can't happen.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For your company, for the discounted cash flows method, how many years out do you forecast?
Generally 5. Let's see if I have. Yeah, so here's an example. This might be, this is a little old, this slide, but so you can see at the top, we got 2012 actual, and then we did 5, well, in this case, we did 6 years, but usually it's 5 years of projections. Now, of course, they're just projections, but that's a big part of this process is justifying what your projections are, and that's what the meetings are for, because as much as past performance is great, what they're buying is the future in the company. So it's surprising actually how much it becomes about people, and that's the reason for that management team, right? So when they sit down at a table and start talking about buying a company, they want to know that this thing's going to continue and it's going to grow, and who knows where the skeletons are and all those kind of things. So it becomes pretty personal once you get past the initial offers. I'm not answering your question, but so it's 5 years. Yeah. Okay. And then just in case that didn't make too much sense before, what we do is, so we'll have the free cash flows, which is this FCF. So all this other thing just gets down to what the free cash flows would be projected out. And then we came up with a 25% discount rate. So even 1 year out, you're going to cut this down by, 20% in the first year. As you go out, there's more risk, so it actually kind of ticks up. But then it's basically 21% squared, you're gonna reduce this one by that much. And so each of these gets knocked down by more because it's out in the future further, so it's worth less and it's riskier. And then what you wind up is with a number, and you get the net present value of the company.
How do you calculate the person being trying to? You talk about the team, the management team, the person wanting to be involved. What if they don't want to be involved? What if they're selling it so they can get out of it? How is that? If the person's the brand, and so if Steve Jobs wants to leave Apple, how does that calculate into things? And what's the negotiation like of trying to get yourself either out immediately or out after a certain amount of years?
Right. So that's one of the big things in the book that we do is a section on that and it's always, and again, this is the personal stuff. It's a story, right? It's there's no cut and dry. It's worth this much money. But
because sometimes people are literally just buying a business to get them off the street.
Exactly.
Or their process. Sometimes people are building them because they know where they are now, and with their dollars, they can grow them, 10, 20 times if that team still stays in there.
So as far as the buyer-seller negotiations go, it's a great question because our favorite answer in this business is it depends. And what it depends on in this case is who's the buyer. So for example, we might have 10 interested buyers. One might be, let's use a logistics technology. One might be a software company that either wants you out of his way or just wants your technology, and they already have an operating company. To them, it's not worth that much. One might be a private equity group that wants to buy and invest in your company and grow, and so they need you because they don't know anything about how to make this happen. So that's where some of the art comes in. It depends on, but we try to help our clients tell the story that if they do want to leave, I've got a client right now who's dying of cancer, which is the first time I've actually had that happen. But so there is no question, that he's going to be leaving pretty soon. So we have to position the whole thing and, make sure that it's understood that there's a team in place that is going to take on the company and continue it. So. I'm answering questions anyway. They're not really the questions you asked, I think. Here's just another table that shows these. So this is how we would line up some public companies, for example, and all this is easy because it's all publicly available. You can just pull down the multiples of revenue, and there's an EBITDA number, because that's what we tend to do is use EBITDA as the baseline to compare deals. So this one sold for 5 times EBITDA, that one sold for 8 times. Again, it's because it equalizes the numbers. Like if you just went by net profit, it wouldn't mean as much because one might have a lot of interest that you're not going to have to worry about. They might have other expenses. So it's just kind of a way to equalize the playing field. And then we do the same thing for the deal comparables, which tend to be a much longer list.
So as a business owner, this is a real pain in the ass.
What's that?
It's a real pain in the ass to have to go through all these things.
To sell?
To try and figure out. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
That's right.
You just write a check.
How easy is that?
Yeah, that's
But
actually
trying to figure it out on their own. Other than those kind of four options, it can be a real challenge.
Yeah, our best clients are people who have tried to do it themselves, actually. Because I think everyone thinks, well, for one thing, people will get offers, right? Once your company gets to a certain point, you'll have guys who go out and just write offers without knowing anything about your company. And a lot of times what an owner will say is, I'm worth at least this much, but you haven't gone through any of this and the reality of what it means to go to market.
We had a guy 2 weeks ago who sold 3 companies, all 3 of which he wasn't expecting.
Yeah.
To do it, where basically people offered it to him. He was like, wow, I don't know what it's worth.
And are they technology companies?
One was
Okay.
A pest control construction company.
Yeah.
So.
And that's the thing. It certainly can be done. You probably left a lot of money on the table, but
He freely admitted that. It was a learning process every time.
yeah. But you know, again, for us, the best clients are, first of all, the right size, but then they've either been through a process that didn't work out, or they tried to do it themselves, or they're in the middle of, like you said, with that other client where they've had an offer, but they didn't realize that that offer is actually very low. Or it could be a phantom offer that, you know, isn't real. It's just someone who wants to look in your books.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So I'm a small company, and before I come to you, I want to just get a ballpark valuation of what my company's worth. And I'm pretty sure you've seen Shark Tank. They have a
Yeah.
calculated valuation. What would be a simplistic valuation that I can use just to kind of get a range in my head before I came to you?
It depends.
You're good at that. You got that one
I
down.
could talk for an hour without answering that one. And it really is difficult to do. I mean, all of this stuff that we do takes a lot of time, and you know, there's a lot of digging in. So it can be expensive if you really want to have a true valuation done. The one thing you could do is look at companies look for stories about companies that are similar to you that sold, or frankly, call me. And if you see a deal that was done that's very similar to yours, and say, hey, is there any information available about, because like all of this came from a private database that we have access to. It's extremely expensive, you know, so you would never get in there. But at least we can say, hey, that one sold for, you know, this many times the earnings or something like that.
And then following that question, there was a big deal that was done with Rent-A-Kill and A-Active, who's a local pest control company.
Uh-huh.
Did you work on that deal,
No.
or do you know about it?
Yeah.
Kevin quoted. Yeah.
No, but you know, could help poke around or whatever. I mean, it's I don't know if they used someone to sell it, or is that
They
the one
did.
you were referring to?
No,
Oh, okay.
they went through a firm.
Probably a business broker. Yeah. And that's the thing. So then you know, we're again kind of an investment bank, and then there's business brokers. Business brokers tend to do, it's a very similar business, but they'll tend to sell, and I don't know if that's this case, but smaller kind of mom and pop businesses, and they'll generally sell it to another person or another local company, as opposed to running this big process with strategic and financial buyers and that kind of thing.
I think this was probably more detailed. Rent-A-Kill is a
Could be.
$1 billion pest
Oh,
control
okay.
company,
Yeah, I didn't know that.
and A-Active was probably around 20 million. So I'm not sure.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know he had the deal that you talked about earlier. He didn't sell the entire company. He sold probably about 70%. He's still on as the acting president.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he brought his wife on as some sort of director or whatever the case may be.
Okay.
But I believe that he's probably going to sell that 30% or whatever you're talking about on the back end.
Gotcha.
So,
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. And yeah, and we wouldn't have anything. So we do mostly technology, defense, and communications related deals. So we're not in that. That's the other thing that these boutiques tend to specialize, as opposed to, you know, just kind of selling a business as a business. But still, we have access to the database that has every deal that has any information that's in there. But one thing that's interesting is if a company is bought by a public company, then you have access to all of the information that the public company puts out, and a lot of times they'll publish how much they paid. And
Is it if the deal is over 20 million, they have to release it by the SEC? Isn't there some sort of minimum that it does become public knowledge?
what they don't, if they do, they don't have to release any of the multiples. So that's the big thing. So what happens is, I don't know about that rule if it is, but a lot of times what they'll do is they'll put information in there if they think it was a good deal. You know, if they way overpaid for something, a lot of times they won't tell you that much about it. So now in Europe, you have to publish all of that stuff. So it's a totally different deal. Anything else? Has anybody gone out for investment and looked at that whole mess of how that happened, how that works, and valuing it?
All bootstrapped.
Because there's this whole pre and post money valuation thing. But I don't need to get into that if it's not. But that's
I think
the
I'm with
basics.
him. I think that I am with him that this is, a lot of this is just way over my head compared to, basic, I launched a business 4.5 years ago. And the basic idea of, you know, if somebody were to ask me tomorrow, what's your company worth? I would have no idea. I mean, do I base that on my fixed assets, on my sales from last year, but there's
Okay, yeah.
intangibles there, like the branding and some website cyberspace and stuff like that. So I just don't know what the basics of the value of a company are.
So that's a great way to put it. So that in reality, the answer is cash flow.
Okay.
So it's, you know, and in particular, future cash flow. So if you have been clipping along at a very small amount and then you get a big contract or a big customer that you can scope out and convince someone that, hey, look, this is about to take off. And that's a lot of times when smaller companies do go to market because they're like, oh no, I can't do this. But the way a sophisticated buyer, or even a semi-sophisticated buyer is going to look at it is cash flow. What cash flows are going to be available for us to take out of it, for us to reinvest in it, so that when we lay out so when we lay this table is going to be one of the most important things, which is the projected cash flows of the company. The rest of it is the story behind those cash flows. I do think people overestimate the value of their brand or IP, even a lot of times intellectual property, if there isn't already some momentum behind the cash flows of the company. That's really what they're going to be valuing in a deal of any size. The only other one is where your competitor, if you do have intellectual property or something like that, and they want to take you out as a competitor. But even then, you have to be sizable enough to be, you know, a threat to someone who's big enough to have money and pay for you.
So let's use numbers. Let's say your business is $120,000 a year, of which you profit. What's 30% of that? $40,000 a year. Is your business worth the multiplier of the 40 or the 120? Because basically, you know, all the other is expenses. So are you looking at a multiplier of the $40,000? So your business is 3 times worth that. So your business is really only worth $120,000, or is your business? And I know it's going to be. It depends. But is the 120 then a multiplier, you know, times 3? Like where should someone be looking at? Just the profits, or what's the number that they look at from that perspective, not the top number?
Yeah, and this is where, so I'll shift more into, this is more in the kind of business broker realm, and the multiples, it is more rule of thumb, I think, at that point. But so what they tend to do is they have the, what do they call it? Basically total value to the owner. So meaning that whole 120,000, what it would take to pay you, you know, you pay yourself, and then it's up to you how much of it that's profit, right? Because the multiples tend to be, if you take that SDE, they call it, like on the websites, the seller discretionary earnings, I think. So those multiples in the end tend to be like 2.5 times that, I think, is kind of the average of that total amount, if you find a good buyer. Now others,
just my business, right? I sell something as a service, so my overhead is the same as Dennis's, who is selling and has, you know, a team and then product that he has to sell in. So
right.
Even if we make the exact same amount of money, he has more expenses than we maybe. So I was trying to figure out, you know, what number you would look at. Is that fair?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
If you do $2 million a year, doesn't mean profit.
Right.
But I hope you do.
But you know, overall though, that profit number is the most important. Now, because if your income is a significant chunk of that, you know, what you need to live, the company, you're now at the point where the company is going to have a high value to someone else, most likely. And part of it, you know, I apologize. I mean, part of it is just kind of the different markets that we're in. You know, we tend to deal with a little bit bigger companies, but I know at that range, it's like between 2 and 3 times that total amount is what most of them actually go for.
And the SD, what was the E again?
Earnings, seller discretionary earnings. So like if you go on Biz Buy Sell or one of those websites, they usually have SDE as term that they use.
So if someone who's used your services, do you then take this information to the lawyer, and how do you fit in with kind of the legal team? You mentioned all those things cost a lot of money, things like that, but how do you kind of pair with the other service providers out there?
So attorneys, the real answer is we try to keep them out of it as long as humanly possible. You know, because in our mind, they are experts at killing deals.
Amen.
You know, I mean, all we do is, in fact, usually by the end of the deal, all we're doing is trying to get the attorneys to shut up, because there's a million things. Sorry, if someone's an attorney, but a deal attorney. I mean, if they're a deal attorney, which there aren't as many as they say there are. People are like, oh, I worked on the whatever deal. That means they chopped a document 100 times, you know, until it was. But
They charge $600 an hour.
yeah, right, exactly. But in the end, they're looking for problems, right? Like, oh, this wording isn't quite right. And we're like, we're trying to get this done. Client's trying to get this done. At some point, you have to close over things, you know, and just get it done. So we try to shut down their email. It doesn't work. Yeah.
Yeah, so, you said you focus on technology companies, right?
Mhm.
So, the speed of change in technology, how can you confidently forecast 5 years out?
It depends.
Yeah, right.
I graduated.
No, it can be magical for sure. It's it's a great question. I mean, it's we do forecasts. They give us the story behind it. We help them craft the story. I mean, and a lot of times the problem with technology, you could be way off, low or high, right? So one of the things that we do is we tend to do this. I don't need to draw with you, but we tend to do this graph that will show like the projected, cash flows, but then it'll have like these different segments of that. It would be down here if this didn't happen, or up here if this did happen, because we're not trying to trick anybody, but we want to show the range of risk, you know, because again, in the end, this is all about risk. How much risk does the buyer see? And our job is to minimize the risk that they see and find the right buyer that has that minimum risk in the whole thing. So we try to lay it out, but then tell the best story that we can about it, of course. So that's where it's more artwork than, like a manufacturer. We don't do many of those deals with manufacturers that have been cranking out the same thing for 20 years. I'm sure it's a completely different market. So I don't know if it's easier or harder, but we, so that's something you can think about too, is a graph like that and how it would look for your company. What are the risks that a buyer would be taking on?
Anyone else? Harry, thank you so much.
All right, thanks. Thank you.